Hello and welcome to Chapter 17, the Media and National Crisis. This is the beginning of Unit 4. Well, we want to open by start talking about two adventurous journalists. They were around during World War I, or the years 1914 to 1918. One was Richard Harding Davis, who you see here on your left, and the other was Floyd Gibbons on the right. Davis seemed to be a writer from the very start, and Gibbons is known, he became famous because of his eyewitness account of a German submarine sinking of the British cruise liner named Laconia in 1917. And that was really big news back then, so newspapers around the world reprinted his story. Okay, here's someone you really need to know about, and that's George Creel and his Committee on Public Information. So keep in mind, we're still, this is around the First World War, also known as World War I. During this time, President Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election, and his slogan was, quote, "He kept us out of war," and that he won in 1916. But in 1917, World War I happened, and there was no way of getting out of it. So because he had said he was the president who would keep you out of war, he needed help from someone who knew how to persuade the public, and that person was none other than George Creel, who you see in the two screenshots to the right, at the top and the bottom. Actually, these are links to videos where you can learn more about World War I and how it changed America, and how George Creel helped President Wilson sail the war. And the video at the bottom is called George Creel and the Great War. So I encourage you to click on those two links and learn more about George Creel and the Committee on Public Information. Okay, next we have, this is a slide about the Crisis magazine. The Crisis magazine was the magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as NAACP. It was founded and edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, and that's a picture of him on the cover. And one of the things he did was he used his publication to argue that President Wilson was more concerned about conditions in Europe than about the plight of Black Americans in the United States. So make sure you are familiar with W.B. Du Bois and his publication, The Crisis. Okay, next we'll talk a little bit about John Reed. Excuse me. Reed was a journalist who gained notoriety for his support of the Bolshevik Revolution. He gave an insider's view of the revolution in his book called 10 Days That Shook the World. And of course, you can read more about his book. A movie was made about his career, I believe, in 1981, and Warren Beatty starred in that movie, so you can do a little background on that. And if you get some downtime, please consider watching that movie. Okay, Walter Duranty. He was a reporter for the New York Times, and he gained prominence covering World War I and became one of the most respected foreign correspondents of this time. And he was unusual because he was sympathetic to the Russian Revolution and the Marxist regime that it placed in power. However, after the war, he misrepresented the Soviet conditions to readers by ignoring serious economic and social problems and by downplaying Joseph Stalin's ruthlessness. So you can read more about him. Okay, notice this chapter is called, I think, something about the media and crisis. So we have World War I, and then we also saw another crisis during this time in the early part of last century, and that was the Great Depression. I have a link here. Let me just highlight that. You have a link to where you can watch more and learn more about the Great Depression. I believe that's a YouTube video. But what was interesting, some researchers did a study of the front page of newspapers that had major circulations, and it showed that there was no significant increase in the stories about economic matters before the crash of 1929, nor during the early years of the Depression. Now this slide talks about a group called the New Dealers. It says President Franklin Roosevelt faced considerable opposition from the press prior to his re-election victory in 1936. And he remained perturbed by the large percentage of newspapers that opposed him and his policies. So what did he do? He went to one of his New Dealers, which was his Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. He was the most pugnacious in dealing with opposition newspapers. And this cartoon you see here is in our book, and on the shirt it says Ickes. So he always came to the rescue of President Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt is the cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, also known, no, this is Franklin Roosevelt. I was just going to say the other Roosevelt is his cousin. They're about 5 years apart. So this is FDR. He had a hard time. He didn't get along with the press like his cousin did. Okay, the press and international aggression. This slide basically gives you a little bit more background on what was happening between 1931 and 1936. It just says that international events between 1931 and 1936 also attracted widespread attention in the press. And we saw Hitler coming to power in 1933, and the Nazi reconstruction of Germany that followed caused a great deal of uneasiness. And with international problems increasing, however, American isolationist sentiment also increased. So just know a little bit, read a little bit more about what was meant by the American isolationist sentiment during that time. War propaganda. The Nazi Party in Germany had used propaganda beginning in the 1920s to advance its ideas, including German racial superiority. Its most vicious campaign was against the Jewish population of Europe, and the most infamous example of the campaign was the Eternal Jew. So I believe this is how you say eternal Jew in German. I could be wrong, but anyway, this was a 1940 film and exhibit that presented Jews as repulsive, brutal, and subhuman, but cunning parasites. So this was the beginning of the attack on the Jewish population. And speaking of attacks and people trying to do harm, this is kind of what happened at Pearl Harbor. This was a major crisis also. It says when Japanese planes bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the act immediately brought the United States into World War II as a combatant. So now we have World War I, we got the Great Depression, and now here is Pearl Harbor. This attack caught not only the military by surprise, but journalists as well. Okay, so now we're into World War II, and what we see happening here is, we talked about this double V campaign You probably remember earlier in the semester when we studied the black press, we learned that black newspapers started what was called the Double V campaign. In other words, after Pearl Harbor, we've already talked about it, but the NAACP's Crisis magazine announced, quote, "Now is the time not to be silent," unquote. So papers like the Pittsburgh Courier agreed and advanced the, quote, Double V, unquote, campaign slogan for victory over our enemies at home and victory over our enemies on the battlefield abroad. Okay, a little bit more about World War II. Ernie Pyle and Walter Cronkite. These are some names that you need to know about in media history. These two journalists were among the 28 journalists chosen to accompany the Allies as they prepared for one of the most significant campaigns of this particular war, the 1944 invasion of France. Also, we see Officer of War Information Chief Elmer Davis, who proclaimed the invasion was the best covered military option in all of history. So, and they give a lot of that credit to people, journalists such as Walter Cronkite and Ernie Pyle. So just remember those names, Ernie Pyle and Walter Cronkite. And just another note, the Arizona State University School of Journalism, I forget the official name, but it is called the Cronkite School. So just wanted to give them a shout out. And we held a conference there when some years ago when I was president of this organization, and they were very nice to me. They were very generous, so just want to shout them out. Okay, that ends this chapter on the media and crisis.